Great.
All
All
right.
right. Thing number one, Jerome Powell says the craziest things.
Yeah. So Powell addressed Congress. He does that twice a year. And he is, so for people who don't know, he's the chairman of the Federal Reserve. And in general, he is very calm and controlled in front of an audience. He's good on camera. He's really good at sticking to his talking points. He's always very well prepared. And he does this thing that I always think is hilarious when, reporters have asked him the same question 7 times in a row. He answers and it's calm, but there's something about his tone that's like, you guys are idiots and I am tired of explaining this to you. But he just does it in a masterful way. That said, so let's go to the details. Powell reiterated his expectation that the next change in the Fed funds rate would be down. The reason that matters, Rob, is because last week we were talking here that, oh my God, we've gotten some economic data that's actually making people say maybe they need to raise rates again. And Powell basically said, no, we're not looking at raising rates. But we are, the next move will be down, but it's going to be later than you think. And it's not going to be 6 reductions. And that's all pretty consistent with what he said before. So that part didn't really take me by surprise.
Question, we reference, you talk about a 2% inflation rate, right? You look at that, you take that over a 40-year working career. That's about 55% of the value of your savings that would be taken away. When you talk about a 3% inflation rate, you're talking up to 70, 69, 70% of that value being taken away. For you, Gary, and for our listeners, and obviously inflation's been a key primary topic over the last 18, 24 months almost.
Yep.
I mean, what is the best option for them to combat these huge numbers when you look at 55 and 69% of total value being lost over a 40-year working career?
Yeah. So let's talk about what Powell actually said and how it relates to your question, Rob. So the thing that Powell said that surprised me, and I am going to read this because it is a direct
Yeah,
quotation. It's really important here. He
please
said
do.
he'd consider rate cuts when the Fed has, quote, gained greater confidence that inflation is moving sustainably towards the 2% target. Okay. So there are 2 things to unpack there. The first one is greater confidence that inflation is moving sustainably. Holy crap, do you realize what he just said? Most people heard, yeah, right, we've got a 2% target for inflation, but that's not what he said. He flat out said they have a willingness, they're looking at lowering interest rates before inflation hits 2% because it's above that right now. And he's basically saying we're not going to stick to this 2% target. We're willing to lower rates ahead of that. And the reason this matters, sorry, everyone, you're about to get a little economic history here. We're going to try to make it not boring, right? But for those of you who are a little bit older, you may remember the horrible, horrible inflation of the 1970s. And for those of you who are younger, you may have read about it. And what happened was that round of inflation actually started in the mid to late 1960s. And the Fed chair at the time was a man named Arthur Burns. And when inflation went up, Burns raised rates to try to get it under control. Inflation started to come down. And Burns let off the accelerator a little too early. He said, oh, well, inflation's coming down. We're heading in the right direction. I think we have it under control. And he started to relax rates, to lower interest rates before we'd hit 2%. And what he ended up with was a re-spike, a spike again in inflation. Burns then got replaced by Paul Volcker, who basically said enough of this nonsense and raised the Fed funds rate. It was close to 20%. I think it was the Treasury bonds were something like 18% at the time, 20%. Killed the economy, killed inflation, got it under control. And one of the reasons why deep knowledge investing has been very much on the hawkish side of things, why we've believed Jerome Powell when he said higher for longer on interest rates, is because I think Volcker is Powell's hero. And I think Powell's biggest fear is being the next Arthur Burns, the guy who let up early and inflation came back and it created a huge disaster. Now, a lot of people right now, particularly political operators, a lot of people in Washington want a higher inflation target. They're saying, well, why can't we target 3 or 4%? And they point to the fact that the 2% target is pretty much random. It was a random number that came out of some like a European economist basically randomly said this back in the 1980s, 40 years ago. So why do we care, right? This is why we care. First of all, the 2% inflation target is immoral and wrong. The correct and moral rate of inflation is 0. And people say, well, what does 2% matter? It stimulates the economy. It does not. That is 100% not true. People get told that in economics courses, but the logic of that is not sound. We can talk about that at greater length another time. It's a much longer conversation. But the government stealing from you slowly adds up over time. And so the point that Robb was making correctly is, let's talk about a 2% inflation. Most people have about a 40-year working career. Maybe, they're young to mid 20s through their mid 60s or so. And over 40 years, a 2% inflation rate steals 55% of the value of your savings. Now, where does that go? That goes to the government, right? It's called seniorage. It's the fancy economics word for the way the government uses inflation to steal from you. And they do it legally, but it's stealth stealing. They do it in a really quiet way. Well, what if we raise that to 3%? Then instead of 55% of your value, the value of your money being stolen, it's 69%. And by the time you get up to a 4% inflation rate over that time, wait, let me just check my chart here. Yeah, you lose 80% of your money, maybe 79. So these are big changes. And people say, oh, what does 1% matter? Well, compounded over decades, it is an enormous amount of theft by the government. And Powell has spent the last 2 years, as you said, Rob, really holding the line, saying higher for longer. I'm not going to be the next Arthur Burns. I'm going to be the revisitation of Volcker. And he'd been very hawkish in saying, we're going to hold the line until inflation comes down. But there he was in front of Congress he did it quietly, he did it carefully, he did it artfully, but saying moving sustainably. Holy crap, he just said, we're looking at moving the target. And I think the target should be 0. 2%, not great, but we can live with it. You start moving to 3 or 4%, you end up with a lot of government theft.
You mentioned, Powell staying true with the higher for longer mantra. Would there be any political motives here at all? I mean, does Powell move in that way, with him kind of, what seems to me, adjusting course a bit? Now, it obviously hasn't happened yet, but we'll have to monitor that.
Yeah, look, there's definitely a political end to this. Democrats in Congress are really putting pressure on Powell to lower rates now. And they're saying, hey, if we get more inflation, who cares? And the reason is it stimulates the economy. We're in an election year. Nobody wants to run for re-election on a bad economy, on low GDP numbers, on high unemployment. Low interest rates and high inflation will make the nominal numbers look good, and it'll get people raises, and it will make the economy worse long term. But it's sort of like being at a party really late and somebody bringing lots of alcohol in, and everybody gets more drunk and the party gets more crazy. The problem is you end up really hungover for the rest of the weekend, and it's a bad idea. But, if you're running for election at 2 a.m. at that party, bring in more alcohol at 12:30 or 1, right? And that's what they want. Now, for the partisans in the crowd who think that I'm picking on the Democratic Party and think I'm being partisan and taking sides, I will fully acknowledge that President Trump, a Republican president before that, openly lobbied the Federal Reserve and Jerome Powell to lower rates. And what he said was, hey, you guys gave Obama, right? You gave him 0 rates, and he had GDP growth and low unemployment because of that. Don't treat me any worse. I want candy too, right? Like, don't stop the flow of liquor when it's my party, right? And so there are political implications for this. There are partisan political implications of this, but I don't, please don't send me messages saying, that I'm picking on the Democrats. They happen to be the ones in Washington right now calling for this. But I freely admit, the last time we had a Republican in the White House, he wanted lower rates too. And the truth is, if I were a first-term president and I wanted to get reelected, I'd want lower rates as well. It's a bad idea, but everybody wants the party to be fun when they're the host.
2 a.m. more alcohol. Everybody likes that. The panic button, I think, is hit the next morning when you're waking up. So
there you go. Right. It comes at a price.